In episode 12, we left off at the beginning of Ray Lamphere's trial. The jury is being selected. 115 men were questioned. Most of them were farmers and merchants ranging from 31 to 72 years old. Each was asked the same set of questions. Had they read of the case? Did they know Mrs. Gunness? Had they formed any opinion on whether she was dead or alive? Were they acquainted with Ray Lamphere? Had they arrived at any fixed belief about his guilt or innocence? And could they be impartial? And ultimately, most were rejected. The majority had heard of the case and formed their own opinions. Welcome to episode 13, The State vs. Ray Lamphere, Part 2. Now, in the days before this trial was to take place, the elections were held. Obviously, the Gunness case would have to wait on more pressing issues like who would have a job after the November election. Locally, the political results were mixed. The Republicans retained the offices of clerk, recorder, and sheriff, and gained membership on the county commissioner's board. The Democrats got the treasurer, prosecuting attorney, coroner, surveyor, and a county commissioner. The Gunness adversaries were still in place. Smith remained as prosecutor, and Sheriff Smutzer's right-hand man, Antis, was the new sheriff, the first to occupy the new county jail, now nearing completion. The case was set to begin the first Monday after elections. Meanwhile, the prosecutor announced a change of plans. He scrapped his original idea of charging Lamphere with the murder of Andrew Helgeline. Instead, he decided to charge him with the murder of Belle and 3 children. Smith said the switch was made to establish once and for all that Belle was dead and buried. "I am tired of this silly rot that she is alive," he explained, "and I have therefore decided to take up the Gunness case proper and put Lamphere on trial for the murder of Mrs. Gunness and her children through setting fire to the house so that it will open up the channel for this discussion." Warden for the defense replied, "We will prove Lamphere innocent without doubt. He was not guilty of setting fire to the house. We can prove he was not there at the time. Besides, we are confident Mrs. Gunness is alive, and so how could he be guilty of murdering her?" Both men were entirely committed to their positions. The editor of Laporte's Argus Bulletin, Harry Burr Darling, wanted to keep readers interested in the case, but there was not yet anything exciting going on to report, so he tried his best to keep readers happy. On November 10th, he outdid himself with a front-page headline as this: "A May Day Celebration." It read as this: "In the spotlight is the maypole, and stretching from its top are 12 long ribbons, each juror holding a ribbon. The entire case of the prosecution hangs on conclusive proof that the Gunness woman is dead. Otherwise, the maypole falls in a crash and the state's argument is broken and shattered. If, on the taking of evidence, the jurors are persuaded as to the death of the woman, the maypole stands, but to convict Ray Lamphere, the state must play the right music. The jurors will refuse to budge from their positions, and the ceremony will be over unless, on each of the ribbons, the state stamps indelible letters the name of Ray Lamphere. Circumstantial evidence must be so woven about this prisoner as to dissipate the last shred of reasonable doubt. In that event, mystery unraveled, Belle Gunness dead, and Ray Lamphere inseparably connected with her death and the deaths of her children, the jurymen might well turn in ribbons, blackened by human murder. Unless this spiderweb of circumstantial evidence is spun around the prisoner, the ribbons will be handed back as they were received, white and spotless." On that same day, the 7th juror had just been selected. Shortly before the afternoon adjournment, Lamphere, looking thin and pale, had briefly passed out and hit his head on the table in front of him. As he tried to bring his head up, blood gushed out of his nose and mouth. Deputy Leroy Marr was there and helped him to his feet and half carried him to the cooler corridor in the courthouse. Sheriff Smuts returned moments later and told the courtroom Lamphere would be able to return shortly. The Chicago newspapers speculated that Lamphere's collapse may jeopardize the entire trial. He returned to the courtroom the next morning, looking worse. LaPorte County Jail's physician had said he feared Ray may have tuberculosis. In the beginning of the third day, there remained 3 jurors to be selected. The defense, led by Wirt Warden, changed its questioning thrust over learning that one of the state's witnesses would be instead a witness for the defense. Dr. Walter Haynes of the Rush Medical College in Chicago changed sides after finding poison in the stomachs of the woman and of 2 of the children found in the burned-out basement. He found enough strychnine and arsenic to cause death. So now, some new questions were posed by the defense even to those jurors already selected. If after the evidence has all been introduced, there was a doubt as to whether the persons whose bodies were found in the fire met death through fire or by poison, would you give the defendant the benefit of that doubt? Prosecutor Smith vigorously objected to this latitude of proof required of the state, and jury selection continued until completed at 4 p.m. that afternoon, Thursday, 4 days after the trial began. The state began its case with an opening statement from Prosecutor Smith. Gentlemen of the jury, there has been an unusual length of time consumed in the selection of this jury. It may seem that there has been a good deal of unnecessary questioning, but this matter is one of great importance. It has gained a widespread notoriety. I want to thank the members of the panel for their patience in the long and somewhat tedious examination. I anticipate that this may take longer than many of you have apprehended. It is always difficult to tell where a lawsuit will end. I trust that you will give the same attention in the trial that you have in the selection of the jury. It is not the business of the prosecuting attorney to abuse everybody. I want to ensure you that my partner, Mr. Sutherland, and myself feel that we occupy exactly the same position that you occupy as officers of this court. We have no animosity to satisfy. We have no axes to grind. We have no spleen to vent on anyone. We are not persecuting anybody. If sometimes we get zealous, it is because of our anxiety to fill our duty. Gentlemen, a dark cloud has fallen upon our country. It is our duty to uncover the mystery and to punish the guilty, if possible. You occupy a twofold position. You are citizens of this county and officers of this court. Now, I want to set rest any idea that we are of necessity trying to fasten the crime upon someone, no matter whom it may be. Somebody has been killed. Somebody has been murdered. And it is your duty to inquire into the matter and find, if possible, the guilty man. Every citizen of the county is interested in the manner in which you do that duty. There has been a lot of notoriety in this case. A lot of gossip has been spread, broadcast to poison people's minds. Of necessity, this must be gone into a certain extent. It is going to be our effort to bring out every fact bearing on this incident. The evidence will be largely circumstantial. There will be some evidence that is positive. People, when they set out to commit a crime, such as the burning of a dwelling, do not start out to do it with a brass band. The first element of our proof will show that Ray Lamphere set fire to the house. The second element of the proof will be that by reason of that fire, Belle Gunness and her 3 children were killed. You have said you would try this case according to the law and the evidence. All we are required to show is that the defendant set fire to the house and that these occupants lost their lives by reason of this act. Along about 6 or 7 years ago, Belle Gunness moved out here on what is known as the McClung Road. Her husband, Peter Gunness, lived with her there some 2 or 3 years and then died under what seems to have been unusual circumstances. They had 1 child, Philip Gunness. Belle Gunness had 2 children by a former husband, she having been formerly married and lived in Chicago. We shall present evidence which will show that this husband died under peculiar circumstances. We are not here to defend the character of Belle Gunness, neither are we here to drag it down. But the evidence will disclose the fact that lots of folks were buried on her premises. The evidence will disclose that Ray Lamphere in June 1907 began to work for Belle Gunness, that he stayed there until February 1908. We shall show that in January of this year, a man named Helgeline came to her home, and that Mrs. Gunness proceeded to lure and get his money from him. The evidence will show that on January 14th of this year, Belle Gunness sent Ray Lamphere to Michigan City on some pretext or other, probably to leave some horses there for someone who was to call for them. In place of staying there that night, as she had instructed him to do, he came back on the streetcar and got off near the powerhouse, and the evidence will show that he made the remark to a man on the car that he was going over to see what the old woman was doing, that he went over and came upon the scene while Mrs. Gunness was disposing of Helgeline and so assisted her in that job. He was Johnny on the spot by putting Helgeline out of the way. She got $3,000, which he had received from a bank in Dakota on a draft, which was cashed in the First National Bank in this city. The evidence will show that Lamphere received some part of that money, and that it was over this amount that the two fell out, and a great animosity grew up between them. On February 3rd, they quarreled, and Lamphere didn't live there anymore. Sometime before this, Mrs. Elizabeth Smith had Lamphere arrested for not paying a board bill, and Mrs. Gunness paid the fine. Soon after this quarrel, Mrs. Gunness had him arrested on the charge of trespass, and it will be shown that she served a written notice upon him to stay off her premises. And when she was convicted in justice court for this offense, it was Elizabeth Smith who paid his fine. The evidence will show that a third time he was arrested, and this time a bond for surety of the peace was made by him. Whether all this is true or not, it is true that there was an animosity between them. The evidence will show that he made the remark, "I'll go to the old lady's house or make it hot for her." We shall prove that he said, "I can make the old lady get down on her knees to me," and numerous statements as to his getting money from the old lady. The evidence will show that this business had caused a breach that was getting wider and wider between the two, and that he kept constantly going over there until the evening of April 27th. On the 27th, Lamphere was living at Wheatbrooks, or in that vicinity, and was making Wheatbrooks a sort of headquarters. On the afternoon of the 27th, he came to town with Mr. Wheatbrook, shortly after dinner for some trivial purpose, with the intention of going back with Wheatbrook. Wheatbrook missed him some way, and Lamphere spent the afternoon around town in the saloons until 5 or 6 o'clock. Then he went to Lizzie Smith's, and after supper went downtown again until 9 o'clock. At 9 o'clock, he went back to Mrs. Smith's and went out and got a pail of beer after that. Lamphere set the alarm for 3 o'clock the morning of the 28th, according to his own statement, and probably 15 or 30 minutes after 3, he started from Mrs. Smith's. The evidence will show by Lamphere's own statement that he took the other road past the Belle Gunness place. He was on the spot. He was right at the house when the fire started, and there was not another living soul at the place. When asked why he didn't give an alarm when he saw smoke from the house, he said, "I didn't think it was any of my business." We next find him over where the Lake Erie tracks cross the road. The morning train was due here at that time at 5 o'clock, and the evidence will show that the train was on time that morning. The train then probably passed that point at about 10 minutes of 5. Lamphere had left the Smith house at a little after 3 o'clock, and here he was 1.25 miles away. In place of walking along the highway, he jumped the fence by the cemetery and ran along the woods up to John Ross's, getting there about 5:30 to get a broadaxe. Along about 7 that evening, he was arrested by the sheriff, and the evidence will show that when the sheriff spoke to him and told him to get on his coat and go to town, his first words were, "Did those folks burn up in that house?" To this, the sheriff replied, "What house?" The foremost thing in Lamphere's mind was the burning of that house. Another phase of this case is the burden resting upon the state to prove the corpus delicti. The indictment with reference to Belle Gunness lays the burden upon us to prove that she died and burned in that house. We do not want in any way to be released from that burden. There isn't anyone who stands for the freedom of American citizens more strenuously than I do. It is the privilege of every man to have a chance for his life. The evidence will show that the night before the fire, one Joe Maxon was staying at the Gunness home as a hired man. On Monday in the afternoon, Mrs. Gunness went to Mr. Leelighter's office and drew up her will, and at Mr. Leelighter's suggestion, rented a safety deposit box in the bank, and into that box she put the will and her private papers and some $700 in money. After that, she went to Minnick's grocery store for her week's supply of groceries, and she also bought a supply of toys for the children, spending some $8 or $10 for necessities of life and the comfort of her children. Maxon remained up until 9:30. The evidence will show that they had supper late in the evening, and among other things that they had for supper, some beefsteak. I want you to remember this fact, for I shall return to it later. About 9:30, Maxon went to bed, and at that time the mother and children were at the table in the home playing games, and nothing unusual had happened. Now, whatever this woman may have done, I don't believe anyone will say that she was other than a good mother to these children. About 4 a.m, Maxon was awakened. He was occupying the upper story of the frame part of the house. Mrs. Gunness occupied the southeast corner room with the little boy. It was the custom of the children to occupy the northwest corner room. Maxon heard them retire. He was awakened by smoke in his room. There was a gale blowing that night from the northwest. He rushed to the window, and the whole interior of the brick was on fire. He tried to burst through the door, but he was unable to do so. He grabbed his clothes and got downstairs and tried to go back and break open the door. But the smoke was so thick he was compelled to go back. He ran around the house, yelling like a wild man. He had heard no sound from the other part. The fire had evidently been started in the outside cellarway. Others came on the scene. They climbed to the room occupied by the children, but there was no one in the room. The bed gave evidence of having been occupied. The evidence will show that the house burned down. One contention will be that Mrs. Gunness became suffocated and died, that the children were awakened by the smoke and ran over to their mother's room into the thickest of the fire and there were suffocated. About 4 o'clock that afternoon, 12 hours after the fire had begun, the sheriff got into these ruins. About 100 or 200 pails of water had been thrown upon the debris. He found the little boy lying in Mrs. Gunness's arms. The debris was from 5 inches to 1 foot under the bodies. A photograph will show a bed spring and mattress under the bodies, and these were lying back down. The forms of the other children were near, laying face down. After the bodies were taken out, they were in charge of the sheriff, and later a coroner's inquest was held. Let me say that up to the time of the discovery of Helgeling's body, there never was any question as to the identity of the bodies. That the autopsy by the doctors, the coroner found on the hand a ring or rings belonging to Mrs. Gunness. We can prove by photographs taken before her death and by engraving that these were Mrs. Gunness's rings. There is a dentist here in Lamphere who did some dental work for Mrs. Gunness. That he did a crown and bridge work on the upper and lower jaws. There are not many more facts to be dealt with. There are some, but these are the material elements of the case. Did Ray Lamphere burn the house? Did he feloniously and willfully do this? Did Belle Gunness and her 3 children meet death because of this act? If we prove beyond a reasonable doubt an affirmative answer to these questions, and I believe we can, we shall expect a verdict accordingly. This was the opening statement of the trial. Stay tuned for The State versus Ray Lamphere Part 3. Like and subscribe for more.